Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is Christina Ma, and today's topic is What's So Special About Hospitals? An examination and look into hospital merger review and analysis. It is rare for a year to go by without the FTC challenging at least one contemplated or consummated hospital merger. The frequency with which hospital mergers have been reviewed means that there is a substantial body of case law and generally accepted doctrine and analysis of such transactions. In this episode of Our Curious Amalgam, we'll speak with an expert on the topic to learn about what makes hospital mergers different. Joining me today is my co-host, Elyse Dorsey. Hey, Elyse.
Hey, Christina.
So what are we talking about today?
So today we're talking about hospital mergers. Hospital mergers are a great topic because they're one of those areas of antitrust law that I think of as kind of always trending. As you just mentioned, there kind of always seems to be some activity on this front, and these mergers tend to keep the staff at the FTC pretty busy over time, I'd say. And I think all these factors make it a really interesting area, and I'm really excited to hear some more about how the agencies have been approaching hospital mergers recently, including how the ongoing pandemic might be affecting these approaches in the last couple of years.
Great. And who is our guest?
Our guest today is Dr. Monica Noether. Monica is a vice president at Charles River Associates, where she specializes in antitrust analysis and other competitive issues related to healthcare and the antitrust industries. And really excited to talk to her because she's had the opportunity to analyze dozens of hospital and health plan mergers. And she also has some experience working at the Federal Trade Commission before she joined CRA. So we'll get a lot of good insights from her today.
Great. Well, welcome, Monica.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. All right. Well, we thought we'd kick it off with, just kind of some basics on hospital mergers to kind of lay some of the groundwork for us. Christina and I understand there's a pretty solid format that the Federal Trade Commission tends to follow in reviewing hospital mergers. Is that right? Could you maybe provide us a high-level overview of, kind of what that entails?
Yeah, no, I do think there is a standard format, and you make a good point that it is the Federal Trade Commission that generally is the agency, at least the federal agency, that takes primary responsibility for analyzing hospital mergers as well as other provider mergers, though I should note that sometimes the DOJ actually can't keep its hands off either. They get interested as well, particularly in like non-merger conduct cases of hospitals, or there are times certainly when hospitals also, for example, operate a health plan, and that's more the jurisdiction of the DOJ. So the DOJ will sometimes get interested there. But it is typically the FTC, and yes, typically there is a standard approach, at least when they get started. And that standard approach, essentially, the FTC is looking at managed care organizations, namely health plans, as the primary customer that they're interested in. How is that health plan going to get affected by a potential merger? And so they think about it in the context of what's been called for several years a model of two-stage competition. And the way that works is that hospitals compete with each other on the basis of price to get included in managed care organizations' provider networks. And then once they, have effectively competed and joined the network, the second stage involves the hospitals competing again with each other directly for the members who are the patients. And in that second stage, they're more competing on non-price terms. Typically, price can enter into it, but often it's quality of, perceived quality of care, service, amenities, things like that. The two stages are clearly interrelated because certainly in the first stage, when the managed care organization is trying to put together the network of providers, they're going to be interested in which providers members care about the most. What's the really desirable hospital, and they're going to be willing to pay more for those. So it's not like it's a completely separate, two steps of an analysis. They are very, very interrelated, but that's just kind of the paradigm in which the FTC tends to view these things. And I think it's also worth noting that because healthcare is local, or often thought to be local, particularly on the provider side, it's not just the FTC and sometimes the DOJ that gets interested, but the state agencies are also going to be quite interested. In particular, attorneys general often work side by side with the Federal Trade Commission, sometimes may even start looking at something before the FTC does, and they're, clearly, very interested in these transactions. And then there are other state agencies that can also jump into the mix, maybe less related to antitrust concerns, but still certainly part of the process. Many states have certificate of need authorities, and those sometimes have a say in whether a merger goes through. Departments of health can be interested at times. And then some states, like my own state of Massachusetts, have healthcare cost commissions, which are often advisory bodies, but often still have a fair amount of influence. And they will certainly be interested in the implications of hospital mergers. So a lot going on, a lot to deal with when you're looking at a hospital merger.
Yeah, so you said a lot there. Perhaps we can unpack it a little. So if a client comes to you and says, we're contemplating, a merger between X hospital and Y hospital, how do you start to think about whether or not there are going to be issues? How do you, effectively issue spot a new matter that comes your way?
Sure. What we try to do, and I don't think this is unique to dealing with hospital mergers, is sort of think about, well, how's the FTC going to look at this, and try to do the same kind of analyses that the FTC is going to do. Healthcare, or hospital care in particular, has an advantage in that every state collects data on every single hospital discharge. And often the databases of hospital discharges are public, or even if they're not completely public, hospitals can certainly get access to them. And what those databases provide is essentially a snapshot, or really a time series even, of every patient who gets admitted to every hospital in the state, the zip code of where the patient lives, the condition that the patient is admitted for, a bunch of demographic stuff, which hospital the patient is admitted to. So this enables the FTC and us to look particularly at kind of market definition issues, geographic market definition issues, identify competitors, but then also to think about how closely the two hospitals that are thinking about merging are to each other. Essentially, how much are they competing with each other now? So the typical analysis, since hospital markets are generally viewed as pretty local, you start by looking at kind of what are the service areas of the merging hospitals? Where are they drawing patients from? And you do that, maybe for different service lines. You might look at primary care, where patients might be willing to travel less far, differently than you would at, say, heart transplants, where people might be willing to go all over the country. And you can kind of tease that out in the discharge data. The FTC, because they're interested in the managed care company as the customer, is going to be primarily focused on commercially insured patients. So one narrows the analysis usually to look at just the commercially insured patients, at least on the price competition dimension. So that can all be done with the discharge data, and you can calculate shares with the discharge data, at least shares of discharges. But I think perhaps even more importantly than the kind of market definition issue is trying to assess closeness of competition between the two merging parties. And there, again, the discharge data are helpful because we can analyze what the diversion between the two merging hospitals is. And what that essentially is, it's sort of a hypothetical thought experiment, is, say you've got about a bunch of patients who are now using Hospital A, and Hospital A wants to merge with Hospital B. What the diversion ratio analysis does is it says, if Hospital A suddenly became unavailable, say, it got swallowed up by an earthquake tomorrow, you can tell I'm visiting California right now, that how many of hospital A's patients would instead choose hospital B? And if a large fraction of hospital A's patients their first choice would be to go to hospital B instead, the FTC is more likely to be concerned than if there are, 3 other hospital systems that hospital A's patients are going to choose before they choose hospital B. So that's kind of the first question. As an economist working for the hospitals, I certainly would do that kind of analysis because I know the FTC economists are going to be doing it. And so we obviously need to know how they're going to be looking at it. But I also find it really informative to talk to the hospital business people. They may not be lawyers or economists, but they live in their business markets. They know what keeps them up at night in terms of their competitive dynamics, but also, other kinds of pressures that are facing them that are affecting the way they, are having to make decisions on a daily basis. So I think, trying to understand their motivation for a particular merger at a particular point in time and what problems they think it is going to solve, I find to be really useful. And it can sometimes lead to further analyses that I might, choose to do about, say if, 2 cardiac surgery units got combined, what can we say is likely to happen about quality or something like that? I'm just, as a for instance.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And I'd like to kind of ask you a little bit more about kind of the different areas. You mentioned as you were talking that the discharge data, it sounds like gives us a kind of granular view that we might not have in a lot of other, antitrust cases where there's not that kind of discrete information available. So how often do you kind of see that as an issue? Like, is the FTC normally focusing on, general admission patients, oncology, cardiology? Do you see the same things kind of popping up, or does it just kind of depend?
I think it really depends on the hospitals that are merging. If you've got, and I think there was a number of years ago, a case where a general hospital was buying an orthopedic hospital. And so then the overlap was in orthopedic services. So naturally the focus was on orthopedics. But I think generally, if you've got the merger of 2 what are called general acute care hospitals, namely, sort of full service, either academic medical centers or general community hospitals, the analysis is going to focus on all of the services that both hospitals provide. Now, what's often the case in a hospital merger is you've got a big tertiary academic medical center that's doing the full range of treatments that's buying a smaller community hospital that may not be providing transplant services, or maybe even not open heart surgery or, extensive neurosurgery, in which case, there's kind of no overlap there. So then the focus would be on what we call, quote, overlap services. And again, the discharge data, because they tell you what each patient is admitted to the hospital for, allow you to narrow in and just focus on the particular services that are overlaps. But I think even within all the overlap services, there may be, a hospital may be really known for its, say, obstetrics and gynecology, its women's health department. And so, the FTC might hone in on that just because of, reputation, or maybe it knows that, there's a service that these 2 hospitals provide among other services, but no other hospitals in town provide the service. So, that's going to cause more concern than, the other services that the 2 hospitals provide, but are also provided by 6 other hospitals. So it does vary. So I guess to answer your question, it's kind of, yes, there can be a focus on specific services, but there's also a focus on anything that is an overlap between the 2 hospitals in general.
I know we want to talk a lot or quite a bit on this episode about some of the potential benefits of hospital mergers, which I know you and your firm have worked on. But before we get there, is there ever, given the recent focus on labor markets and monopsonies, is there ever concern about competition for doctors as opposed to thinking about consumers?
Good question, and good point to raise, because now it's very nuts. We'll get to monopsony in a second, but I think more than half of all physicians now are actually employed, not all employed by hospitals, but a lot of them are employed by hospitals. And often, hospitals have acquired physician groups before they engage in whatever the hospital merger is that's currently being investigated. So a parallel concern that the FTC is going to have when it looks at a hospital merger is there's certainly when they issue that voluntary access letter that you're inevitably going to get if you announce a hospital merger that is remotely has any overlap, you're going to get a val. And one of the things that we'll be asked about is, tell us about all the physicians you employ, or tell us about all the physicians who are in your clinically integrated network on whose behalf you are negotiating managed care contracts because they are clinically integrated with you. So there's a horizontal overlap concern that the FTC is going to have. And I should have said also, beyond the inpatient service overlaps that the FTC is going to look at, they're going to look at overlaps in outpatient services. So a lot of hospitals own ambulatory surgery centers, or even just, office buildings where physicians are practicing. They're going to, or labs or imaging facilities. They're going to be curious about all of those overlaps. Now, often on the outpatient side, there are lots of other competitors, non-hospital-based competitors, but it doesn't mean they're not going to look at it. But getting back to your question about monopsony, I think this never used to be an issue in hospital mergers. But, just yesterday, the FTC and the Rhode Island Attorney General issued a complaint to stop the proposed merger of the two largest systems in Rhode Island, CNE and Lifespan. And one of the issues that was raised by, I think, both the AG and the FTC was a potential concern about skilled labor. And, I haven't read the details of everything yet, but my sense was that there was a lurking concern about monopsony there. So yeah, I think that's, the general increase focused on labor market issues and monopsony in labor markets, I think, as well as sort of non-compete provisions and things like that is coming into the hospital market as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, sounds like maybe we could do a follow-up episode on some of that later. But as Christina mentioned, we also wanted to make sure today that we talked some about the potential benefits of hospital mergers. So I think you gave us kind of a really good overview of, the concerns that tend to trigger the FTC analysis and what they start thinking about kind of right away once they see, one of these mergers pop up. But, we understand you and your firm did some research that suggested that there could also be very significant consumer benefits from hospital mergers. So could you elaborate on some of those for us?
Sure. A few years ago, my colleague Sean May and I did a few different analyses on behalf of the American Hospital Association. And we had a unique opportunity in that work to combine rigorous quantitative econometric research on the effects of hospital mergers with more qualitative research that was based on structured interviews with the leadership teams of about, I think, 20 hospital systems nationwide, all of which had undergone some consolidation. In doing the interviews with hospital leadership, we got to get their views on their motivations for engaging in hospital mergers and acquisitions. And there was the not unexpected recurrent theme that mergers provide them with scale. And that scale has, kind of an immediate and obvious benefit of increasing the volume of services over which they can spread their fixed overhead costs. That's true. That's not unique to hospitals. Certainly true of anything. But also, I think important was an increasing focus on the ability to maintain and advance a fairly costly and largely fixed cost infrastructure that's necessary to promote, data-driven, value-based care, essentially and I think we're going to talk a little bit maybe in the future about, sort of the increasing technology impact on hospital operations. But I think hospital leaders are very conscious of the need to really use data that they have, use their data to come up with, better practice, more efficient practice patterns, more cost-effective practice patterns. And so that, that was a big theme. And then I think there's also just a real growing focus on not just focusing on the delivery of particular individual services, but really thinking more holistically about population health and how do you maximize population health, which is thinking not just about inpatient hospital services, but all of the healthcare services that patients consume, as well as all of the what's called social determinants of health, the factors that are determined by the zip code that patients live in, income, access to food, access to housing, things like that, and how hospitals often can serve as sort of coordinating functions for that. And things like that require scale as well. The hospital leaders also spoke about the benefits of reducing the cost of capital. Particularly, many of the hospitals that get acquired are hospitals that are in poor financial state and therefore don't have good access to capital, and it becomes a vicious cycle for them. They can't get access to capital, so they can't upgrade their facilities, which makes them less attractive to doctors, so doctors go practice elsewhere, and then they don't have any patients, and it just becomes this sort of downward spiral. And so being able to provide hospitals that are acquired with greater access to capital so that their facilities can be upgraded is another big motivation. And then I sort of touched on this when we were talking about the importance of data and technology, but I think a lot of hospital leaders see substantial benefits in clinical quality that are really attributable to being able to standardize clinical protocols and develop, best practices across all of their different hospitals. And you can do that short of a merger, but it's a lot easier to align physicians' incentives. Physicians are often described of as it's sort of like herding cats, but if you've got them all under the same roof, it can be sometimes easier and get them engaged in the process of designing the best practice protocols. So that was kind of the qualitative piece of the study. The econometric analysis focused on an analysis of what happens to hospital costs, what happens to hospital revenues, and a little bit, to some extent, what happens to quality after a merger. And what we did there was we compiled the universe of hospital mergers over a multi-year period and focused on the acquired hospital. And then developed a control group of hospitals that were similar in their characteristics to these hospitals that were acquired, except that they didn't go through an acquisition. And we did what economists would call a difference in difference analysis. This namely looked at changes in hospital costs, changes in hospital revenue per patient, pre to post mergers, and changes in quality, and looked to see whether there was a differential impact if the hospital had been acquired. And what we found was that hospital acquisitions were associated with a statistically significant, I think it was about 2.3% reduction in annual operating expenses relative to expenses at the control group hospitals. We found that revenue per admission was also reduced statistically significantly, which suggests that any cost savings are in fact passed on to customers. And then we found modest improvements in quality measures like mortality rates and readmission rates for some specific conditions. I should say that measuring quality is and looking at changes in quality is something that where the science is still pretty young, just because the measurement is still difficult to do in any kind of standardized way. But the results that we found were certainly suggestive, at least, of quality improvements as well.
Great. So yeah, that sounds like, a lot of potential, very real benefits to consumers coming out of these mergers as well that the agencies, should be keeping an eye out for. And you talked about this a little bit, including in that answer, but can you, develop specifically now a little bit more the role of technology in these hospital developments, electronic health records and, innovative apps are, becoming increasingly a big deal, and how do they kind of play into this world?
Yeah, I think, as I noted, it was another theme that, was certainly on the minds of hospital leaders when we interviewed them. And when and as I do hospital mergers now, I hear about it as well, the increasing role of technology and developing database protocols and using artificial intelligence. And I think, not surprisingly, because of this increased focus, the whole healthcare landscape is evolving and changing, and there are a whole bunch of new players that are really thinking about healthcare. And I think, again, it's a situation where independent hospitals are going to increasingly struggle because, technology and use of big data is just so benefited by scale. And I think independent hospitals are just going to have a really harder time keeping up without at least some kind of affiliation. And in terms of newer players, I think they really are going to play an increasing role. I mean, one example I know that, is currently under investigation, this proposed transaction of where Oracle wants to buy Cerner. Cerner is one of two of the leading electronic medical records companies. And I think, I don't know how, obviously, I don't think any of us knows how it's going to come out, but I think it reflects a general movement by tech players into the healthcare space. Some other examples, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, they're all getting into the healthcare space. And it's all because I think of this increased focus on big data and the use of algorithms and things like that. So, I think there will be, increasing incursion by players that didn't used to be thought of as healthcare players into the healthcare space. And that's going to affect, I think, in the long run, how hospitals operate and therefore how they compete. So definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, well, and I think that's, a great transition as we're getting to, kind of the last few minutes of our time together here in terms of, what should we take away in terms of, looking to what's coming next in hospital mergers. The pandemic has taken its toll the last couple of years. Have we seen changes there, and what other changes might we see on the horizon?
Yeah, I think the pandemic kind of brought out, it maybe didn't raise new issues, but I think it brought to the front issues that were lurking already. Supply chain shortages. I think, hospitals historically, in their drive to become as efficient as possible due to, pressures by reimbursement, had really been engaging in just-in-time inventory management. And that broke down with COVID, as we all know from reading the newspaper. And I think it's another area where scale doesn't solve the problem, but it can help. You just have less variability. When you have a spike in something, if you're larger, you tend to have a little bit more cushion and you can handle that variability better. Same with staffing shortages that we're seeing now, particularly in the recent months of COVID, sort of the cumulative effect of staff burnout as well as staff themselves getting sick. If you're bigger, you can deal with that a little better than if you're a small rural hospital where, a third of your staff can easily get wiped out in a given day, and you have to close down a whole unit. Isolating patients in a particular ward, again, scale can help. So I think all of those things they're not new issues to healthcare, but I think they were issues that were just heightened by COVID. I will say one maybe good thing has come out of COVID, and that is an increased focus on telehealth. It's not new because of COVID, but I think it has, the usage of telehealth expanded immensely during COVID for obvious reasons. Reimbursement of it also improved. And I think that's a genie that's not going to go back in the bottle. I think everybody has realized the benefits of telehealth. And I think, that could have some implications for how hospitals compete, or certainly how physicians compete in the long run in terms of thinking about what are the contours of the market. If telehealth is here to stay, and obviously it doesn't treat everything, but it can treat a lot of things. So I think it's going to create some new questions, I guess, as well as and new ways of thinking about hospital competition and healthcare markets generally.
And have you seen, or how do you think the FTC is going to be handling some of these changes in the hospital context?
Well, I think the FTC certainly is going to continue to be vigilant in its review of hospital mergers and healthcare markets in general. I don't think that's anything new. I mean, healthcare has been a big focus of the FTC for years and years. I think, for several years now, almost half of its budget has been on healthcare, broadly defined, and about 50-50 between provider reviews and as well as life sciences, medical devices, and pharma. I don't think that's going to stop. I think that will continue. I do think there are some new areas that the FTC is thinking about more with respect to hospital markets in particular. I think because consolidation in hospital markets has not just been horizontal, but has been vertical as well. We talked about hospitals buying up physician practices. We talked about hospitals sometimes having their own health plans, having a bunch of ancillary services. I think there's more interest in vertical transactions, recognizing that there can be some real inherent benefits in vertical consolidation, but also concerns about potentials for exclusion from vertical transactions. So just, I think, more review of vertical issues in transactions, either vertical transactions per se or vertical aspects of horizontal transactions. The FTC has also recently gotten interested in what's called cross-market mergers. These are mergers where you would traditionally say, thinking about geographic markets as being relatively local for hospital services, there's just no overlap between these, two hospitals that want to buy. That used to be end of story. You didn't have to do anything except prove that they were in completely different markets. Now the FTC might say, not so fast. Is there a possibility for harm still? Because even though the two hospitals are in different markets, they might share some customers. They might share, a large employer might have a major headquarter in the two cities where the two hospitals are. And that could, they could therefore, essentially become a must-have, even though they are in different markets. The FTC hasn't brought a case in that area yet. In fact, they just cleared a case in Michigan a month or two ago that involved the merger of a hospital system on the eastern side of Michigan and on the western side of Michigan, where I understand there was, very little geographic overlap, and so they did clear that one. But I think that was, they were looking at that on the basis of a potential cross-market merger theory. So I think, that interest will continue. And then we talked briefly about labor markets, but I think labor markets and how they play into hospital mergers are going to continue to be a concern. Are there concerns about non-compete clauses that hospitals might have entered into with their employed or affiliated physicians? Are there potential monopsony concerns? So I think that's going to be an issue. I think also, this isn't directly hospital-based, but I think the FTC may continue to be more interested in smaller transactions that might not be reportable, but, for example, combinations of physician groups or hospitals buying physician groups where, it's too small to cross an HSR threshold, but might still warrant some competitive review. And then finally, as I just mentioned, the role of telehealth, and is that going to influence the way the FTC and other authorities think about hospital mergers?
Well, certainly a lot to be looking to in the months and years to come, and we'll see if the FTC ends up bringing any cases that touch on these sort of new theories of harm that diverge from, the typical analysis. So Monica, before we let you go, we like to ask all of our guests a few questions. The first is to tell us something interesting about yourself that those you work with wouldn't know about you.
I think actually some of the people who work with me or have worked with me for a long time probably do know this, but I'll say it anyways. When I started out my quasi-adult life, I thought I wanted to be a photographer. Economics was kind of the last thing I had in mind. I came from a family where both my parents were university professors, and I was not going to do anything academic. And it was only when I realized that I didn't have it in me to become a starving artist for some number of years that I turned more practical and turned to economics. And then I got into health economics because my first job out of college, since all I had was this degree in photography that wasn't going to keep me employed, was an administrative position that happened to be for a health trade association. And I got interested in, healthcare from that perspective, and then sort of have been applying it ever since. So.
Well, I hope you haven't given up your photography, even though you do your economics in the day-to-day.
Yep. It's a hobby, though.
And do you have any advice for young professionals, young economists who are looking to do what you do?
How I would advise young people is, find something that you find really fascinating. And it's going to be a lot more fun there. You're going to be working hard for decades of your career, and you might as well have fun doing it. And for me, it was healthcare and healthcare economics, perhaps because it's something that touches all of us, and, therefore it has a lot of personal significance for everybody I know, but also because for me, healthcare markets are really dynamic. They've changed a lot in the decades that I've been looking at them. So it never gets boring, which gets back to my first premise: find something that you find really fascinating and enjoy it.
Great. Now for our final segment, what we call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
I'm going to ask you to pick a number 1 through 10.
7.
7. So tell us about a teacher who had a major influence on you.
Probably, I took one and only one economics class when I was in college. And I was a senior before I finally got around to doing that. But I needed to, find something to round out my schedule. And I ended up taking, what's called Econ 101 with a guy named Mike Lovell at Wesleyan University. And I didn't actually go into economics for another few years after that, but it was, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do that would actually advance my career professionally, I went back and thought, gee, I really did enjoy that class in economics that I took as a senior in college. Maybe I should try some more of that. And look where it got me.
There you go. And the fact that it kept your attention even senior year of college says something, right? So here you are many years later. Anyways, Monica, thank you again for your time today. And to all our listeners, thanks for listening to this episode of Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org. Antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.